Israel wanted a king. And they kept coming to the prophet Samuel. And they were like, we want a king. And God was like, you don't want a king. Kings are bad. They do all sorts of bad stuff to people. And you're going to owe your life to your king. You don't want a king. And the Israelite says, no, no, no. We want to be like everyone else. We want a king. And so finally, God tells Samuel, all right, let them have a king. And so he told Samuel where he would find the king. And the name of the king was named Saul. And Saul was the first king of Israel. And he was a good king. He was strong, handsome, and tall. People looked up to him. The ladies thought he was gorgeous. And it was like the picture of what you would want for a king. But as Saul wore the crown, eventually he got to believing that he knew what was right and wrong. And when God asked him to do something, Saul said, no, I think I know what's right here, and I'm going to do it this way. And God came to Saul, and he said, Saul, you're no longer the king. You can't be king. If you're not going to listen to me, I'm going to pick someone else to be king. And God spoke to him through Samuel. And so Samuel had to deliver this message to Saul, and it hurt Samuel because Samuel loved Saul. Saul was a good guy, but he thought he knew what was right. And so Samuel was mourning. And eventually God came to Samuel and said, Samuel, enough mourning. How long will you cry for Saul? I'm going to send you to pick the next king. And so he sent him to the house of Jesse. And Jesse had a lot of sons. And the youngest one was named David. Samuel showed up to Jesse's house to anoint the next king. And he brought forth his first son. And he was big, tall, muscular, and good looking. And God was like, nope, not that one. And he said, how about my next son? And he brought in his next son. And he was like, no, not that one. And finally, he got through all the sons that Jesse had brought before him. And he said, no, it's none of these sons. Do you have another son? And Jesse was like, well, there's the younger one. He's kind of a mama's boy, kind of pretty looking. He's out tending the sheep. We didn't think he's really king worthy. And Samuel said, okay, go get me this one. And so he went and got him. And then in came David. And God said, there's my next king. Well, Saul was still king at this time, even though David had been anointed king. And the Philistines came up and went to go to battle against Israel. And Saul was terrified because he knew God wasn't on his side anymore, that he had left God's side and God wasn't with him anymore. So there was this man named Goliath, and Goliath was over 9 feet tall, and he was big and strong. He was a giant of a man. Like NBA players today, they're only 7 feet tall, and they look huge. Goliath was 9 feet tall. He was massive, and he'd stand up and he'd go,
send me your best warrior, and I will fight them.
And Saul would have been the perfect guy for this. He stood over a foot tall above everyone else. He was a big man himself. He was the leader, but he was terrified because he wasn't with God anymore. And so for 40 days, Goliath stood up. And Jesse, whose older 3 sons had gone to war with Saul, sent David to go check on them. And he called David and he said, David, I need you to take this roasted grain, some bread, and some cheese to your brothers in the battlefield. And so David took the stuff to his brothers, and he left early in the morning, and he got there just as they were lining up with battle cries and the excitement was going on. And then out steps Goliath. And he says,
send me your best warrior and we will fight. And whoever wins the other will be subject to them.
And no one moved. And David looked around and he's like, what's up with these people? Don't they know that we have God? Why don't they stand up and fight? And when his brother heard him talking about this, he was like, what are you doing here? Did you come to see a battle? And David's like, no, I haven't done anything of the sort. I just want to know why no one is standing up to fight. And someone heard him talking about this with another person. And they went to Saul. And they're like, we have a person that wants to fight. And Saul sent word to bring David. And David comes in. And Saul's looking at David. And he goes, you can't fight Goliath. You're too small. You're just a boy. You can't fight Goliath. And David looks at Saul and goes, Saul, I tend my father's sheep. And when a bear came or a lion came and carried off the sheep, I rescued the sheep. And when they turned on me to attack me, I grabbed him by the head and killed him, because God is with me. And I know God will deliver Goliath into my hand. And Saul was convinced. David was a good salesman. And Saul was convinced. And so he gave him the king's armor. And David started to walk around and it was all clunky and he couldn't move. And he said, I can't wear this. I can't wear this. Here, Saul, thank you for trying to help me out. But I got to do it my way. And so he went down to the river and collected 5 smooth stones. And when he said,
send me your best man,
out started to walk David, this little boy, young man. And he started to walk towards Goliath. And Goliath looked at him and started to laugh. He was like,
what am I, a dog that you would send a boy out with a rod? Go home and I won't hurt you.
And David said, I have God on my side, and you mock him, but he will deliver you and the Philistines into my hand today. And Goliath was furious. And he said,
I will squash you like a bug.
And he started to go towards David. And David picked up his sling and started slinging the rock. And released it. And it struck Goliath right between the eyes. And he fell. And David ended Goliath. And the Philistines saw their champion defeated and started to run. And the Israelites realized that they had a champion, and they chased after them and chased them out of the valley. Now David had a secret on his side. You see, David was anointed to be king before he ever faced Goliath. And there's an important thing I want you to remember, that you too are anointed by God. You are a royal priesthood. That's what the Bible says. You are a royal priesthood selected by God. So when you face your giants in life, know that you can have the courage and that God is on your side to face any giants.